She had nothing left to steal, yet they took everything anyway. A widow, 3 starving children, a town full of pointing fingers and empty hearts. In one brutal evening, Hannah Reed lost her dignity, her safety, and the last dry roof over her family's heads. Not to a storm, not to fate, but to the cruelest thief of all, a lie told by powerful men who needed someone to blame. But on that same dark road, soaked and shivering, one lone cowboy made a choice that would shake an entire town to its foundation. If justice ever had a face, it wore a dusty hat and rode alone. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. Dust, hunger, and the weight of a mother's name. The sky over Harlan Flats had not seen a full rain in 11 months. That was the kind of fact people in frontier towns kept track of the way city folks kept track of money. Precisely, obsessively, with a growing dread that the number would only get worse before it got better. 11 months of cracked earth. 11 months of withered crops. 11 months of watching the wells drop an inch every week until some of them showed nothing but dark stone at the bottom and the faint, mocking echo of a man's own voice calling down into them. The town of Harlan Flats sat in the belly of a wide, flat prairie, and the kind of place that maps from back east labeled vaguely as frontier territory, which was cartographer language for we don't rightly know what's out there, and we're not entirely sure we want to. The town had about 400 souls on a good census year. A single main street with a row of wood-fronted buildings bleached pale by relentless sun, a church with a sagging steeple, a grain exchange that smelled of burlap and ambition, and a saloon called the Iron Horse that never seemed to close, even when everything else did. In good years, and there had been good years, people swore it, though fewer and fewer could remember them clearly. Harlan Flats was a decent place to plant roots. Cattle ranchers ran operations out on the surrounding plains. Farmers worked the creek-fed lowlands to the south. A twice-monthly supply wagon connected them to the larger trading post 40 miles east. And though nobody got rich in Harlan Flats, most people got by. But this was not a good year. This was the kind of year that peeled a town down to its bones and showed you exactly what it was made of underneath. Hannah Reed had moved to the edge of Harlan Flats 18 months ago, after burying her husband, Thomas, in the hard ground of a failed homestead 2 counties over. Thomas had been a good man, not a remarkable one, not a man history would remember, but good in the ways that mattered most. He worked without complaint. He loved without condition. He never raised his hand and never raised his voice above what the situation required. When the fever took him in late autumn, it took him fast, the way fevers sometimes did out there, and Hannah had spent 3 days at his bedside and 4 more figuring out how to survive without him. She was 31 years old when she arrived at Harlan Flats, with a wagon that had 1 cracked wheel, 2 mules that were past their prime, and 3 children who looked to her for everything. Eliza was 12. Serious, dark-eyed, the kind of child who absorbed the weight of adult situations without being asked. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she had appointed herself the unofficial protector of her younger siblings, with a ferocity that would have been funny if it hadn't also been heartbreaking. Will was 8, gap-toothed and restless, with a mind that moved faster than his mouth and a habit of wandering that gave Hannah regular episodes of low-grade terror. He had a good heart, Will did. He just wore it on the outside where the world could get at it. And then there was May, little May, barely 4 years old, with curls the color of autumn wheat, and the gravely serious expression of a child who had seen her father buried and understood, in some wordless way, that the world was not as safe as it had once seemed. Hannah had found a small piece of land on the eastern edge of town, barely an acre, with a 1-room structure that called itself a house only by the most generous possible definition. She paid for it with the last of what Thomas had left her, set up a kitchen garden, took in mending work from the wives of ranchers, and began the slow, grinding work of keeping her family alive. For a while she managed. Then the drought deepened, and managing became surviving, and surviving became something she had no word for at all. By the time the incident at the market happened, Hannah had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. She had made sure the children ate. She always made sure the children ate, rationing out the last of their dried beans and cornmeal with a precision that would have impressed a military quartermaster. But there was simply not enough, and a mother's arithmetic always came up the same. You give the children what there is, and you go without, and you tell yourself it's fine, and some nights you believe it. The Harlan Flats Market ran every Thursday on the open lot beside the grain exchange. In good years, it had been a genuine event. Farmers bringing vegetables, women selling preserves and bread, a few ranchers trading dried meat. Now it was a diminished, anxious thing. Half the usual vendors weren't there. What remained was priced so high that ordinary families stood in front of the tables doing calculations in their heads, their expressions caught somewhere between determination and defeat. Hannah had come that evening with 4 coins, the last of what she'd earned from a week of mending work, and a careful list in her head of what those 4 coins could stretch to cover. A small bag of flour if she was lucky. Maybe salt pork if the price hadn't gone up again. Enough to get through another week if she was careful. Eliza walked beside her, holding May's hand. Will trailed behind, stopping every few feet to examine something on the ground. "Will," Hannah said, without turning around, "stay close." "I'm close," Will said. "Closer." He caught up, shoving his hands in his pockets with the elaborate casualness of a boy who wanted it known that he was choosing to comply, not being made to. They moved through the market slowly. Hannah studied prices, did the mental arithmetic, felt the familiar knot form in her chest when the numbers didn't work. Around her, other families were doing the same. Thin-faced women counting coins, men shaking their heads at price boards, children pulling at sleeves and being told, "Not today, not today." She had just reached the far end of the market, had just decided on a small bag of grain meal from a farmer named Ott, when the shouting started. It came from the center of the lot, near the main supply tables run by Silas Crow's men. There was a crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, and then a voice, loud, carrying, designed to be heard by everyone present. "Stop them! Someone stop those thieves!" Hannah turned. A man named Hector Gill, one of Crow's market hands, a broad-shouldered, sunburned man with a face like a closed fist, was pointing directly at her. Not near her, not past her, at her. "They took it!" Hector bellowed, sweeping his arm to include not just Hannah, but all 3 of her children in the accusation. "The widow and her brats! I saw them with my own eyes. They stole from the supply table." The market went silent. 40 people, maybe more, turned to look at Hannah Reed. She felt the heat of it before she could form words. That specific, terrible heat of being stared at by a crowd that has already decided what it sees. "I beg your pardon?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, barely. "You heard me." Hector moved toward her, not with the hesitation of a man who might be wrong, but with the certainty of a man who has already decided he's right. "We're missing 2 sacks of cornmeal and a side of dried beef from the back table. And I saw your boy poking around back there not 10 minutes ago." Every eye moved to Will. Will had gone pale beneath his summer tan. His mouth was open. "I was just looking," he said. "I didn't touch anything." "Boy says he didn't touch nothing." Hector's voice carried that particular contempt that men like him deployed against children they had already decided were guilty. "Course he does. My son does not lie." Hannah's voice had changed. Something in it had hardened, something that had been forged through 18 months of doing impossible things alone. She stepped forward, putting herself between Hector Gill and her children with a movement so natural it required no thought at all. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I've been on this side of the lot for the past 15 minutes. Ask anyone." "Asking anyone," said a woman near the front of the crowd, a woman Hannah recognized as the wife of one of the town council members, "is how we find out what everyone saw." The way she said it made clear that she had already formed her own conclusions. "I want to see your bag," Hector said, nodding at the canvas carry bag hanging from Hannah's shoulder. "Open it up." "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Open it." Hannah's jaw tightened. She looked at Hector. She looked at the crowd around her, the watching faces, some curious, some already hostile, some wearing that worst of all expressions, the carefully neutral look of people who want to see how this ends before they decide which side they're on. She opened the bag. It contained 4 coins, a folded piece of mending work, a small knife for general use, and a biscuit she had wrapped in cloth for May in case the little girl got hungry. No cornmeal, no dried beef, nothing that wasn't already accounted for. There was a pause. Hector's eyes moved over the contents. His jaw worked. And then, instead of stepping back, instead of offering the single word that the moment required, he looked up at the crowd and said, "Maybe she passed it off to the others. Maybe they've already moved it." Hannah stared at him. "Maybe," she repeated, very quietly. "These kinds of people," said the council member's wife, louder now, with more confidence now that the crowd had not immediately objected, "always travel in a group for exactly this reason. One distracts, the others carry. These kinds of people." Hannah understood in that moment exactly what was happening, and understanding it did not make it easier to bear. It made it worse, because there was no evidence. There was nothing in her bag, nothing on her children, nothing except Hector Gill's word and a crowd that had been hungry and frightened for 11 months and needed, desperately, something to be angry at. And she was standing right there. It happened quickly after that. The crowd moved the way frightened crowds do. Not all at once. Not with any single voice giving the order, but with a collective shift in posture and proximity that communicated, without words, that certain people were no longer welcome in certain spaces. Someone bumped Hannah's shoulder. It was probably an accident. She didn't think it was an accident. Someone said, close enough for her to hear, "Should have known better than to let them come to market." Eliza moved to her mother's side, chin up, eyes fierce, holding May's hand so tight that the little girl whimpered. Will pressed himself against Hannah's back. "We are leaving," Hannah said. To her children, to herself, to no one in particular. She walked. The crowd parted, but not with courtesy, with the pointed, deliberate parting of people making a statement. Nobody reached out to stop her. Nobody called her back with an apology. A few people refused to meet her eyes. A few others watched with something that might have been shame if shame had been enough to move them. It wasn't. They made it to the edge of the market lot before Hector Gill called after them one more time. "We'll be watching," he said. "The whole town's going to be watching." Hannah did not turn around, but her hands were shaking. She got them back to the small house on the eastern edge of town. She put May down on the cot they shared, tucked the blanket around her, and sat for a long moment on the edge of the thin mattress with her hands pressed flat against her knees, waiting for the shaking to stop. Eliza stood in the doorway watching her. Will sat on the floor against the wall, his knees pulled to his chest. "Mama," Will said finally, "I didn't take anything." "I know. I was just looking at what they had. I wasn't—" "Will." Hannah looked at her son. "I know. Do you hear me? I know." Something in his face released, just slightly. "What do we do?" Eliza asked. Her voice was steady. That unnerving 12-year-old steadiness that both reassured and broke Hannah's heart in equal measure. "We sleep," Hannah said. "And tomorrow we figure out what's next." She said it with more certainty than she felt. That was the job, had always been the job, of being the only adult in a family of 4. You said the certain thing even when the ground beneath you was anything but. The storm came in the night. It announced itself with the particular stillness that prairie storms favored. A sudden drop in the wind, an eerie quiet, the sky going from dark to a bruised, greenish dark that was different in a way that made animals uneasy, and people look up from whatever they were doing. Hannah woke to the sound of the first thunder crack. May was already stirring beside her. Eliza sat bolt upright on her own pallet across the room, and Will appeared in the doorway from where he'd been sleeping in the narrow back corner, his eyes wide and his hair sticking up at angles. "Mama," May said, "the sky is angry." "It's just weather, sweetheart." But it wasn't just weather, not entirely, because when Hannah went to the door and pushed it open, she found a note nailed to the outside frame. A single piece of paper, the ink run slightly from the first drops of rain, the words written in a rough hand that had not tried to hide its contempt. "Thieves aren't welcome in Harlan Flats. Leave by morning or find out what happens when decent people run out of patience. No signature." Hannah stood in the doorway with the rain starting to fall against her face, the note in her hand, reading it once, twice, 3 times, as if the meaning might change. It didn't. She turned back into the house. "Get your things," she said. "Mama." "Eliza, please, get your things." They left in the dark with the storm breaking overhead. Hannah had the carry bag, a rolled blanket, the 4 coins she hadn't spent at the market, and her children. And that was the entire accounting of everything she owned that she could carry with her on foot in the rain. She took them east along the main road out of town, moving fast, keeping to the side of the road where the ground was higher and less likely to flood. May rode on her back, wrapped in the blanket, her face pressed against Hannah's shoulder. Will walked beside her, not complaining, not asking questions. He seemed to understand in the way that children sometimes do, that this was not a moment for questions. Eliza walked behind, watching their backs. The rain came down harder. By the time they reached the old split pine tree that marked the half-mile point from town, Hannah's clothes were soaked through, and her boots were letting in water, and her arms were burning from the weight of May. She stopped, not because she had reached a destination, but because she had run out of road in her mind, had run out of the next step, the next plan, the next thing a person does when they've done all the things, and it still hasn't been enough. She stood in the rain beside the split pine tree and looked at her children and felt something she couldn't afford to feel and set it aside with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had been setting hard things aside for 18 months. Think, she told herself, think. She was still thinking when she heard the sound of a horse on the road behind her. Colt Maddox had been riding back from the Eastern Trading Post since late afternoon. He was 40 years old, lean in the way that outdoor men went lean. Not thin, but carved down to what was necessary, and no more. He had dark eyes under a pale hat brim, hands that were scarred in the way that working hands got scarred, and a face that people described, depending on their disposition, as either weathered or hard. He had been riding this stretch of road for 17 years since he came to Harlan Flats as a young man with $30, a horse, and the kind of stubbornness that either killed you or made you something. He'd made himself something. The Maddox Ranch, 60 acres of it, south of the main road, was his, clear-titled, worked by his own hands, and the occasional hired help. It wasn't a grand operation, but it was his. He was thinking about a fence line that needed repair when he came around the bend and saw them in his lantern's reach. A woman standing in the rain beside the split pine tree, 3 children around her, all of them soaked to the bone. He pulled up. He took in the situation the way men who have lived alone on the frontier learn to take in situations, quickly, without assuming, with a specific attention to what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. A woman, 30 maybe, dark hair plastered against her face, a little girl on her back, wrapped in a blanket that was losing the battle against the rain. A boy, maybe 8, standing beside her with his fists clenched at his sides in the way boys clenched their fists when they were trying not to show that they were scared. An older girl behind them, watching the road back toward town. The older girl was the one who noticed him first. She went still, the way young animals went still, when they weren't sure yet whether the new thing was a threat. "Easy," Colt said to the girl and to his horse in one word. He looked at the woman. "You all right, ma'am?" Hannah Reed looked up at him. Her expression in the lantern light was one he recognized. Not fear exactly, and not defeat exactly, but something in between. The look of a person who has been pushed to the edge of something and is now standing there, recalibrating. "We're fine," she said. He looked at the rain. He looked at the little girl asleep against her back. He looked at the boy's clenched fists. "You got somewhere to be?" A pause. "We're working on that," Hannah said. Colt was quiet for a moment. He had heard things in town, had heard the talk about the widow and her children, the missing food, the market incident. Harlan Flats was not a large town, and its talk traveled fast. He had listened to it with the reserved judgment he applied to most things, which was to say he had not formed a strong opinion either way, because strong opinions formed on secondhand information had a way of making fools of people. But he was looking at a woman and 3 children in the rain, in the dark, on a road that went nowhere good in a storm like this. He made his decision the way he made most decisions, without great ceremony and without hesitation. "My ranch is a mile south," he said. "Got a fire and a roof and some food that doesn't amount to much but beats standing out here." He looked at Hannah directly. "I'm offering, ma'am. Nothing more complicated than that." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She was, he could see, doing the calculation that a woman alone in her situation had to do with any offer from any stranger. The accounting of risk against the accounting of need, done fast, done without the luxury of certainty. "My name is Hannah Reed," she said finally. "These are my children, Eliza, Will, and May. Colt Maddox. He touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am. Another beat of silence, rain hammering the road, thunder rolling somewhere close. All right, Mr. Maddox, Hannah said. We accept your offer. He dismounted, tied his horse to a slow walk, and led the way south off the main road. Behind him, Hannah Reed adjusted the sleeping weight of May on her back, took Will's hand in her left and Eliza's in her right, and followed a stranger through a storm toward something she had no way yet to name. The Maddox Ranch appeared out of the dark the way good things sometimes appeared after a long time spent in bad weather. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. First the shape of the fence line, then the dark bulk of the barn, then the warm orange glow of a window. One lit window, in a house that was plainly built and plainly kept, but solid. Real. The kind of structure that had been put up by someone who intended to stay. Colt held the door open. Hannah carried May inside first. The warmth hit them all at once. The specific warmth of a fire that had been burning for hours, settled and deep and unconditional. May stirred on Hannah's shoulder, opened her eyes, and looked around the room with the slow, owlish confusion of a child waking from sleep. Where are we? She asked. We're inside, Hannah told her. We're warm. May considered this, then she said, Good, and put her head back down. Colt moved to the fire, added wood, began doing the efficient, unhurried things that a man did in his own kitchen when he had decided to feed people. He said very little. He did not ask questions. He put a pot on, sliced bread, found a jar of something preserved that he set on the table without explanation. Will sat in a chair near the fire and looked around the room with open, undisguised curiosity. Eliza remained standing for a while, watching Colt with an appraising wariness that he did not seem to take personally. Hannah stood in the center of the room and tried, very quietly, to get herself back under control. Sit down, Mrs. Reed, Colt said, without looking up from the stove. I'm fine standing. I know you are. Sit down anyway. She sat. The meal, when it came, was simple. Bean soup with salt pork. Bread. A small jar of peach preserves that Will fell on with a contained but obvious reverence that made something tighten in Colt's chest, though he didn't let it show. They ate mostly in silence. The fire crackled. The storm moved over the roof, doing what storms did, and for a while the sound of rain was just weather again. The kind that meant the earth was drinking, rather than the kind that meant you were out in it with nowhere to go. When the children were done, Colt showed them to the back room, a plain space with a spare cot and enough blankets. Eliza and Will settled May between them with the practiced ease of older siblings who had done this particular job many times before. Within minutes, all three were asleep. Hannah came back to the main room and stood near the fire. Mr. Maddox, she said, I want you to know, you don't have to explain anything to me tonight, Colt said. She stopped. He was sitting in the chair across the fire from her, one boot propped on the other knee, turning his hat slowly in his hands. He looked at her directly, without the deflecting pity that she had learned to dread from people who meant well, but still somehow made everything worse. Tonight you sleep, he said. Whatever needs explaining can wait until morning. Hannah Reed, who had not slept a full night in longer than she could accurately remember, sat down in the chair across from Colt Maddox. The fire burned. The storm said what storms say. Outside the window, the prairie was dark and wide and indifferent in the way that only the frontier could be. And inside this small, plain, solid house, for the first time in a long time, the darkness felt like it stopped at the door. She closed her eyes. She did not mean to fall asleep, but she did. And in the morning, everything would still be hard. The town would still be watching. The accusations would still be out there, hanging in the air over Harlan Flats like smoke after a fire. None of that had gone anywhere. But for one night, on the edge of the drought-stricken frontier, a widow and her children were warm. They were fed. They were safe. And sometimes, just sometimes, that is the thing that keeps a person standing long enough to fight back. The morning after the storm came in quiet and gold. The prairie had that particular washed-clean quality that only appeared after hard rain. The dust settled, the air carrying a coolness that wouldn't last past noon but was generous while it did. Colt was already up before first light, moving through his morning chores with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had been waking before dawn for so long that his body no longer required an alarm of any kind. He fed the horses, checked the fence line along the south pasture where the storm had knocked a post sideways, hauled water from the well, and had coffee heating on the stove before the sun had fully cleared the flat eastern horizon. He did not wake his guests. He let them sleep. It was Eliza who appeared first, coming out of the back room with May on her hip, and a wariness in her expression that softened only slightly when she saw the coffee and the pan of cornbread Colt had put together from what he had in the larder. She set May down at the table without a word, poured the little girl a cup of water, and stood near the doorway watching Colt at the stove with those dark, measuring eyes of hers. "You cook for yourself every morning?" she asked finally. "Most mornings," Colt said. "You live out here alone?" "I do." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "Doesn't it bother you?" Colt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes," he said. "Then I remember all the things that come with not being alone, and I find I can manage." Eliza almost smiled. Almost. Will came out next, trailing a blanket and looking like a boy who had slept harder than he had in months, which was almost certainly the truth. He sat down at the table, saw the cornbread, and had the manners to look at Colt before reaching for it. "Go ahead," Colt said. Will needed no further invitation. Hannah was last. She came out of the back room with her hair pinned back and her dress straightened as carefully as a woman could manage who had slept in her clothes, and the expression on her face was one that Colt recognized. The expression of a person who had spent the first few seconds of waking recalling exactly where they were and exactly how they'd gotten there, and was now in the process of deciding how to handle it with dignity. She was good at it. He could see that. She wore her situation without apology, which was its own kind of pride. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "Good morning." "Morning. Coffee's on the stove, cornbread's on the table. Help yourself." She poured her own coffee, sat, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the children eating and the distant complaint of a crow somewhere out on the fence line. Then Hannah set down her cup and said, "I need to be honest with you about last night. You don't owe me." "I know I don't owe you. That's not why I'm doing it." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know who you helped, because I suspect that by this morning, Harlan Flats has already formed an opinion about the kind of man who helps people like us, and I think you deserve to have the facts before you decide how much that matters to you." Colt leaned back in his chair and said nothing, which was his way of saying, "Go ahead." She told him. She told him about the market, about Hector Gill's accusation, about the empty bag, about the council member's wife and her particular species of contempt. She told him about the note nailed to her door. She kept her voice level and her account precise, and she did not ask for his sympathy, only his understanding. When she finished, Colt was quiet for a moment. "You didn't take anything," he said. "No? And neither did your children." "No." He nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Then somebody decided it was easier to blame you than to look for who actually did." "That's my assessment as well." Another silence. Outside, the crow had moved on. The morning light was doing what morning light does in that part of the country, growing slowly brighter, turning the prairie from gold to a pale, shimmering amber. "Well," Colt said finally, "I've got a fence post that needs resetting, a water trough that needs patching, and about 40 other things that don't get done by themselves. If you and your family need a place to stay while you sort out what comes next, I've got a barn loft that's dry and a spare room that isn't much, but it's something. In exchange, whatever work you're able to do around the place, I'd be grateful for it." He paused. "That's not charity, Mrs. Reed. That's a fair arrangement between two people who both need something." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that took a full inventory of a person, searching for the angle, for the catch, for the thing underneath the thing being said. She didn't find one. "All right," she said, "fair arrangement." The first rider came from town 3 days later. Colt was out in the south pasture when he saw the horse coming up the road, moving with the purposeful speed of someone carrying a message rather than making a social call. He recognized the rider as he got closer, a man named Decker, who served on the town council and ran the feed store on Main Street, a man whose opinion of himself ran considerably higher than the opinions others had of him. Colt walked to the fence line and waited. Decker pulled up and looked down from the saddle with the expression of a man who was about to deliver news he was personally enjoying. "Maddox." "Decker. Word's gotten around town that you're sheltering the Reed woman and her children out here." "That right?" I'm here on behalf of several concerned citizens to advise you that this is not considered a wise decision. Colt looked at him. Noted. Decker blinked. He had clearly anticipated more resistance, more engagement, something he could push against. Colt's flat, unhurried response had thrown him slightly off his prepared speech. He recalibrated. Those people are thieves, Maddox. The whole market saw a woman with an empty bag and a man making accusations. Those aren't the same thing. Decker's mouth tightened. Hector Gill is a reliable witness. Hector Gill works for Silas Crow. I've found that reliable is a relative term when it comes to men on Crow's payroll. Colt tilted his head. Is that what Silas sent you out here to tell me? That his man Jill is reliable? Something shifted behind Decker's eyes, just briefly, just for a second, and then it was gone, smoothed over by the expression of bureaucratic indignation he'd arrived with. Nobody sent me anywhere, Decker said. I'm here as a concerned citizen. Then as a concerned citizen, you can ride back and tell the other concerned citizens that what goes on at the Maddox Ranch is my business. The Reeds are here, they're working, and they'll stay as long as they need to. Colt turned back toward the pasture. Good day, Decker. He heard the man sputter something behind him, then heard the horse turn and move back up the road. He did not watch it go. Hannah had heard none of the exchange. She had been, at that moment, on the other side of the barn, helping Will restack a load of hay bales that had gotten disorganized in the storm, a task Will had appointed himself to with a seriousness that suggested he understood, better than most 8-year-olds might, that work was the currency with which they were paying for shelter and safety. You got to push from the bottom, Eliza was telling him, from where she stood on a higher bale observing operations. If you push from the top, it just tips. I know how bales work, Will said, grunting. Clearly, Eliza said. Eliza, Hannah said, without looking up from the bale she was maneuvering, help your brother instead of supervising him. Eliza descended from her bale without further commentary and helped. They worked steadily through the morning, and there was something in the rhythm of it, the physical, uncomplicated rhythm of work that had a visible result, that Hannah had not realized she'd been missing. In town, her work had been invisible, largely, mending clothes that belonged to other people, cooking in a kitchen that felt like borrowed space, trying to keep a family together in a place that had never fully accepted their presence. Here, the work was tangible. A hay bale moved was a hay bale moved. A fence post straightened was a fence post straightened. The ranch didn't care who she was or what people said about her. It simply offered tasks, and she completed them, and the day moved forward. By the end of the first week, she had settled into a routine. Mornings, she worked alongside Colt. Whatever the ranch needed, she learned to do it. Afternoons, Eliza watched May while Hannah took over the cooking, which she was considerably better at than Colt was, a fact she established gently and he acknowledged without embarrassment. Evenings, after the children were down, she and Colt would sometimes sit on the porch in the cooling air, not talking much but not needing to, which was its own kind of comfort. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about a person who did not volunteer information but did not withhold it either. She learned that he had come to Harlan Flats young and built the ranch himself, post by post, that he had been close to a woman once, years ago, but that it had come to nothing in the way that things sometimes came to nothing out here, not from any dramatic falling out, but from the slow grinding pressure of hard seasons and harder choices. That he read more than people might expect, from a shelf of battered books along the wall that ranged from history to surveying to a collection of poetry he had owned so long the spine had given out. She also learned that he was already asking questions around town. She found out about it from Will, who had the accidental intelligence-gathering ability of a child who was easy to underestimate. Mr. Maddox went to town today while we were doing the water trough, Will reported one evening, sprawled on the floor near the fire while Eliza braided May's hair. I saw him ride out, and when he came back he had papers. Hannah looked up from her mending. What kind of papers? Don't know. He put them in the desk, but he looked like he was thinking hard about something. Hannah looked at the closed door to Colt's front room, where his desk was. She looked back at her mending. She let it go for one more evening. The next morning, she waited until the children were occupied with morning chores, found Colt at the corral fence doing the slow, attentive work of watching his horses move, the kind of watching that wasn't really about the horses at all, and stood beside him at the fence. Will says you went to town, she said. I did. He says you came back with papers. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I stopped by the Grain Exchange Records office, asked to see the inventory filings from the last 3 months. Hannah was very still. Why? Because something about the timing of all this doesn't sit right with me. He turned to look at her. Market prices in Harlan Flats have gone up 40% in 6 months. That's drought-related, everyone says. Supply and demand. But I've been watching supply wagons come through town for 17 years, and the number of wagons coming through hasn't dropped the way you'd expect if the shortage was just about the drought. He let that sit for a moment. So either the drought is somehow selectively affecting the supply wagons while leaving the roads intact, he continued, or there's another reason the market is short. And if there's another reason, then the question of who benefits from the shortage starts being a more interesting question than who stole 2 sacks of cornmeal. Hannah was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. You've been looking into this, she said, on our account. I've been looking into it because if someone in this town is engineering a shortage and letting starving families take the blame for it, that's something worth knowing. Mr. Maddox, Hannah's voice was careful. You could lose standing in this community over what you're already doing. If you start making accusations against... I haven't made any accusations, Colt said. I looked at inventory records, that's all. He paused. But I'll tell you what I found if you want to know. She held his gaze. Tell me. Silas Crow filed 3 different supply reports to the town council in the past 2 months, claiming crop yields were down across 4 counties. But I know a man at the Eastern Trading Post, a man named Farrell, who handles incoming freight, and according to Farrell, the incoming load volumes from those counties haven't dropped significantly. The goods are arriving. Colt's jaw tightened. They're just not making it to the market. The silence between them stretched long and careful. Where are they going? Hannah asked. That's the next question. The second rider from town came at the end of the 2nd week. This one was different from Decker, younger, one of the general store boys. And he came not with the pompous authority of a concerned citizen, but with the nervous energy of someone delivering a message he'd been told to deliver and wasn't entirely comfortable with. He handed Colt a folded letter and left quickly without making eye contact. Colt read it on the porch. Hannah was nearby, shelling dried beans into a pot, and she watched his expression without appearing to watch it. It didn't change much, but it changed a little. Anything serious? She asked. Letter from the town council, he said, advising me that my annual grazing permit, the one I need to run cattle on the Eastern Common Pasture, is under review. Hannah set down the bean she was holding. Under review, based on what? Based on concerns regarding the character of persons associated with the Maddox Ranch operation. He folded the letter. Which is a formal way of saying they want to put pressure on me without looking like that's what they're doing. Colt. Hannah hesitated over the name. It was the first time she'd used it rather than Mr. Maddox, and she noted his small, brief acknowledgement of it. If this costs you that permit, it costs you grazing rights that you need. Financially. I can't... You're not responsible for what the council decides to do. I'm the reason they're doing it. No. His voice was flat and certain in a way that left no room for argument. Silas Crow is the reason they're doing it. Because Silas Crow has enough of the council in his pocket to pull the strings he needs to pull. You're just the occasion. If it wasn't you, it'd be something else. He looked at her directly. That's an important distinction, Mrs. Reed. I'd appreciate it if you'd hold on to it. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon wind was moving through the prairie grass with its low, constant sound. The background note of that whole landscape, that whole season. Somewhere in the barn, May was talking to one of the horses in the earnest, detailed way that she talked to animals, apparently confident they were following every word. What are you going to do? Hannah asked. I'm going to ride out to the old Alderman property tomorrow morning, Colt said. There's a storage depot on that land that Crow leased about 4 months ago, supposedly for equipment. Hannah waited. I want to see what kind of equipment Silas Crow needs a 3,000-square-foot storage depot for, Colt said. In the middle of a drought, in a location nobody passes by. He left before dawn, which was how Colt did most things that mattered, quietly, without announcement, before the world was fully awake to watch. Hannah woke when she heard his horse leave the yard. She lay in the dark of the back room and listened to the sound of hooves fade into the prairie silence. and she felt something that she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Something she didn't entirely want to name just yet because naming it felt premature and possibly dangerous. She got up. She started the stove. She made coffee and cornbread and waited. He was back by mid-morning, riding in at the kind of pace that communicated information without words. Not panicked, not casual, but deliberate. The pace of a man who had found what he was looking for and was now thinking carefully about what to do with it. Hannah met him at the corral fence. He dismounted, looped the reins, and looked at her with an expression that was controlled but alive underneath. The expression of a man keeping something important in careful check. "It's not equipment," he said. She already knew it wasn't going to be equipment. "What is it?" "Grain, dried goods, salt pork." He paused. "Enough to stock a market for 3 months, stored in sacks with the supplier marks still on them. Some of the sacks had Harlan Flats inventory stamps." The words landed between them and sat there. Hannah pressed her hand flat against the fence rail, needing something solid. "He's been diverting the supply," she said. It wasn't a question. "Been moving it off market before it gets to town, hiding it out on the alderman land, waiting for prices to climb high enough to make selling it worth his while." Colt's voice was quiet, but it had something underneath it. Not quite anger, not yet, but the pressure of anger building toward a surface. While people in this town have been stretching their last coins, while families have been watching their children go hungry, Silas Crow has been sitting on enough food to feed Harlan Flats through the rest of the drought. And then some. And he needed someone to blame, Hannah said. He needed people angry at something other than the prices. So when food went missing from the market, he didn't need to look far for a convenient target. The silence that followed was not the comfortable evening silence of the porch, the quiet between two people who did not need to fill space with words. This was the silence of two people standing beside something ugly that had just been brought fully into the light. Hannah was very still. Then she said, "Can you prove it?" "I've got the location. I've got my own eyes on what's in there. I need documentation, invoices, shipping records, something that ties those stores directly to Crow's diversion rather than just being goods he can claim he purchased legitimately for resale." He looked at her. "I know where some of those records might be, but getting to them is going to require moving carefully, and it's going to require time." "He'll know you were out there," Hannah said. "Maybe. He'll move against you. He's already moving against me. The grazing permit letter is the beginning." Colt's eyes were steady. "That's fine. A man who moves first thinks he's already won. Sometimes that's when he's most exposed." Hannah looked at him. This man she had known for 2 weeks, this stranger who had opened a door in the rain and offered soup and cornbread and asked for nothing she wasn't able to give, and who was now standing at the edge of something that could cost him everything he had spent 17 years building. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Came out simpler and more direct than she intended. Colt was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard. In the barn, May had apparently finished her monologue with the horses and could now be heard explaining something at length to Will, who was responding with the patience of a boy who had learned that arguing with his little sister was almost never worth the effort. "Because it's the right thing to do," Colt said finally. "And because those records in that depot are evidence of something that hurt a lot of people in this town, not just you, and because—" He stopped, adjusted, tried again. "Because I've been riding this stretch of frontier for 17 years, and I've watched a lot of people get run over by men like Silas Crow, and I am tired of watching it." He said the last part with a quietness that was more forceful than shouting would have been. Hannah held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded, a small, firm nod that meant she understood, and that she was with him in whatever came next, and that she was not going to make it sentimental because neither of them needed that right now. "Then let's figure out what you need," she said, "and let's get it." What came next was harder than either of them said aloud. The pressure from town increased steadily over the following week. The grazing permit review was formalized in writing. 2 of Colt's oldest trading relationships, men he'd bought supplies from for years, sent polite but unmistakable notes saying they'd be unable to extend him credit for the upcoming season. A rumor circulated in town that the Maddox Ranch was harboring not just a thief, but a woman of questionable moral character, which was the particular weapon that small towns had always deployed against women who made people uncomfortable, and it was no less poisonous for being familiar. Hannah heard about the rumor from Eliza, who had overheard two women talking during a brief necessary trip into town for supplies. Eliza reported it with her jaw set and her eyes showing a fury that was very carefully being kept from becoming tears. "What do we do about it?" Eliza asked. Hannah thought about that for a moment. She thought about the kinds of answers she could give. The practical ones, the measured ones, the careful ones designed to protect Eliza from something she was already too old and too clear-eyed to be protected from. Then she thought about the woman she actually was, as opposed to the woman she sometimes tried to perform for her children's sake. "Nothing," she said. "We work. We do what's right. We let the truth be the truth and trust that it has weight." She looked at her daughter. "And we don't let people who are trying to make us feel small make us small. Those are two different things, Eliza. People can say whatever they want about us. What we actually are is ours." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You really believe that?" "I really believe that." Another pause. "Okay," Eliza said, and she went back to work. By the end of the third week, Colt had compiled a careful, methodical record of what he'd seen in the Alderman Depot, cross-referenced against the public market price records for Harlan Flats over the past 6 months, and against the shipping manifests he had managed to obtain copies of, through Farrell at the Eastern Trading Post, who turned out to have a long memory and a slow-burning resentment toward Silas Crow that he'd been keeping banked for years, waiting for an occasion to use it. It was not a complete picture, but it was enough to raise questions that Silas Crow would not want raised in public. The town council had scheduled an open gathering for the following week, a regular quarterly event where community grievances were aired and town business was discussed. It was the kind of occasion, Colt understood, that Silas Crow would use. He had already heard, through Farrell, that Crow intended to bring the matter of Hannah Reed formally before the assembled townspeople, to make it official, to transform rumor and market day accusation into something that looked, at least on the surface, like the community rendering a considered judgment. Hannah found out about this the same evening Colt did. She was sitting at the table when he came in from the barn, and something in his face told her before he said a word that the situation had shifted. He sat down across from her. He told her what he'd heard. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that May, who had been half asleep on the cot in the corner, stirred and murmured something without waking. "He's going to do it publicly," Hannah said. "Yes." "In front of the whole town?" "Yes." She pressed her lips together. Then, "And you're going to be there." It wasn't a question, but Colt answered it anyway. "I'm going to be there." Hannah looked at the table, at the worn grain of the wood, the coffee ring from a cup set down that morning, the small, accumulated evidence of ordinary days in a borrowed space that had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to feel less borrowed. She looked up at Colt. "Then so am I," she said. Outside, the prairie held its long, dry breath. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the window, the frontier stretched on without end, indifferent and vast and waiting, the way it always waited, to see what the people in it were made of. The week before the town gathering moved slowly, the way weeks do when something important is sitting at the end of them. Colt spent most of it working, because the ranch still needed working regardless of what else was happening, and because physical labor had always been the thing that kept his thinking clear and his judgment from getting ahead of his evidence. He fixed the fence line along the northern boundary. He moved the cattle to the far pasture where the grass had come up slightly after the rain. He did the 100 small, unglamorous tasks that a ranch demanded of a man who ran it alone. And while his hands were busy, his mind was moving over everything he knew about Silas Crow and arranging it in the order that would matter most when the time came to put it in front of people who had been told a different story for months. Hannah worked alongside him, as she had every day since the first morning. She had learned the ranch the way she had learned most things in her life, by watching once, asking the necessary questions and none of the unnecessary ones, and then simply doing it. She could now handle the morning feed, manage the water trough, read the weather signs well enough to know when to get the horses in before a wind shifted, and she had developed a rapport with Colt's aging bay mare, a horse named Biscuit, who had a firm opinion of strangers but had apparently decided after 4 days of Hannah bringing her apples and speaking to her in a low, even voice, that the widow was an acceptable human being. Will had adopted this verdict enthusiastically and spent considerable time in the barn with Biscuit, ostensibly helping but mostly carrying on the same kind of one-sided conversation that May conducted with all animals, as though he had learned the habit from his little sister rather than the other way around. It was on the fourth morning of that final week that things shifted. Colt had ridden into town for supplies and came back 2 hours earlier than expected, moving at a pace that Hannah had learned to read as controlled urgency. She met him at the corral, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders before he even dismounted. Something had changed. "Crow knows I was at the Alderman property," he said, looping Biscuit's reins with hands that were steady but deliberate. "Word got back to him. Somebody saw me out there and reported it." Hannah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. "What is he doing about it?" "He's moved the goods." Colt turned to face her. "I rode past the depot on the way back. Locks are new. Wagon tracks heading south, heavy ones, recent. He's relocated the stores somewhere I don't know about yet." He paused. "And he's filed a formal complaint with the town council against me, claiming I was trespassing on property he leases and interfering with legitimate private commerce." "Can he make that stick? Legally?" "Probably not. The Alderman land is technically common territory. Crow's lease is for depot use, not exclusive access. But that's not really the point." His jaw tightened slightly. "The point is that he's putting me on the defensive publicly, before the gathering. He wants the town talking about whether Colt Maddox is a trespassing troublemaker instead of talking about what Colt Maddox found on that property." Hannah was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "He's a careful man," she said. "He's a smart man," Colt said. "There's a difference. Smart men make good moves. Careful men don't make bad ones. Silas Crow is both, which makes him more dangerous than either alone." He looked at her. "But he moved fast, which means I was close enough to something that scared him. A man who isn't worried doesn't relocate 3,000 square feet of stored goods in the middle of the week." "The Farrell manifests," Hannah said. "Still have them. And the price records, and my own testimony about what I saw in that depot." He shook his head slightly. "It's circumstantial without the physical goods. Compelling, maybe, to reasonable people. But Crow's been managing the reasonable people of this town for a long time." They stood at the corral fence in the afternoon heat, the cattle moving slowly in the far pasture, the prairie doing its endless impersonation of a thing that had no stake in human trouble. "There has to be something else," Hannah said, "something he can't move." Colt looked at her. "Paper," she said. "He's been doing this for months, diverting goods, manipulating prices, filing false reports with the council. That kind of operation doesn't run without a paper trail somewhere. Invoices, payment records, someone who received money for staying quiet." "I know where his records are kept," Colt said slowly. "He runs his accounts out of the back office at the grain exchange. But that building doesn't open to just anyone." "Does it open to Farrell?" Colt went still. "Farrell handles incoming freight," Hannah said. "Freight that goes through the grain exchange. He'd have legitimate reason to be in that building, in those records, verifying his own manifests." She looked at Colt. "Does Farrell want to see Crow exposed badly enough to help us?" There was a pause, the kind of pause in which a man reconsiders what he thought he knew about a woman's mind. "I'll ride back out to the trading post tomorrow," Colt said. Farrell turned out to be a small, precise man in his late 50s with ink-stained fingers and the kind of organized mind that kept meticulous personal copies of every document he had ever handled. Not out of any specific plan, but simply because he was the sort of man who could not bear to let information disappear. He had worked freight logistics on the eastern frontier for 30 years and had crossed paths with Silas Crow exactly twice before the current situation. Once during a contract dispute that Crow had won through a combination of legal maneuvering and sustained pressure, and once during a rate negotiation in which Crow had simply smiled and waited for Farrell to run out of options. Farrell had never forgotten either occasion. When Colt laid out what he needed, access to the grain exchange records, specifically the incoming load logs for the past 6 months cross-referenced against Crow's reported market inventory filings, Farrell listened without interrupting. He sat in the small back office of the trading post with his hands folded on the desk and his expression revealing nothing, in the manner of a man who had spent a lifetime keeping his own counsel. When Colt finished, Farrell was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, produced a neat folder of papers, and placed it on the desk between them. "I've been keeping my own set of the manifests," Farrell said. "Going back 8 months. I had a suspicion about the load volumes not reconciling with what was being reported in Harlan Flats, and I have a habit of preserving evidence of my own suspicions. He looked at Colt over the desk. I didn't know what to do with it. A man in my position, making accusations against a man in Crow's position, without someone willing to stand behind it publicly, it goes nowhere. Colt looked at the folder, then at Farrell. Are you willing to stand behind it publicly? Another pause, longer this time, and weighted with the particular gravity of a man measuring what it would cost him against what it would cost him not to. I'll be at the town gathering, Farrell said. Colt came back to the ranch that evening with the folder under his arm and something in his face that Hannah had not seen there before. Not quite relief, because there was still too much uncertain for relief, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has been carrying weight alone for long enough that having someone else's hand on the rope makes a difference he hadn't let himself anticipate. He spread the papers on the kitchen table after supper while the children were in the back room. Hannah sat across from him with the lamp turned up, and they went through them together. Farrell's careful freight manifests against the council-filed shortage reports, the numbers telling a story that Crow's eloquence had been covering for months. The discrepancy was not subtle once you were looking for it. Load volumes coming into Harlan Flats had dropped no more than 12% over the drought period, a figure consistent with regional supply pressure, moderate but manageable. The shortage reports Crow had filed with the council, the reports that justified the price increases he had driven through at the grain exchange, claimed drops of 35 to 40%. The difference between those two numbers had been, for Silas Crow, a fortune in the making. Hannah tracked the columns with her finger, moving through the numbers with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 2 years managing a household on a fraction of nothing and knew precisely what numbers could tell you when they were honest. He was systematic about it, she said quietly. He didn't take everything. He left enough coming through to market that no one would think to question the base level of supply. He just diverted the excess, the portion above what people expected to see, and stored it until prices climbed high enough to make releasing it profitable. And the shortage reports to the council gave him cover, Colt said. If the council believes there's a 35% supply drop, they don't question why prices are at 35% above normal. They accept it as consequence of drought, not as consequence of a man with enough influence to make drought look worse than it is. While hungry families look at empty shelves and blame each other, Hannah said, the words came out flat and precise, and they sat on the table between the two of them with the particular weight of things that are simple and monstrous at the same time. Colt looked at her. Her face in the lamplight was very still, the stillness she went to when she was holding something tightly so that it wouldn't show in her expression. He had learned to recognize it over the past 3 weeks, the face she put on when she was deciding that what she felt was going to have to wait until there was time to feel it properly. Hannah, he said. She looked up. We have enough, he said. Farrell's manifest, the council filings, the price records, my testimony about the depot, it's not a confession, but it's enough to put questions in front of people that Crow is going to have a very hard time answering. She held his gaze. You think the town will listen? Some of them have been waiting for permission to stop believing what they've been told, Colt said. That's all this is. Permission. 2 days before the gathering, Silas Crow paid a personal visit to the Maddox Ranch. Colt saw him coming from the far field, riding alone, which was unusual for Crow, who generally preferred the company of men he had on his payroll, the way powerful men often preferred a supporting cast that made them feel larger by comparison. He was riding a black horse, well-fed and gleaming in a way that stood out on a drought-stricken frontier like a deliberate statement. He was a large man, Crow, well over 6 feet, broad in the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome in a severe way if the calculation behind it hadn't been quite so visible to anyone paying attention. He rode up to the gate and waited, which was a power move, making the man he'd come to see come to him rather than dismounting and coming forward himself. Colt walked to the gate at his own pace and stopped on his side of it. Silas, he said. Colt. Crow looked down from the saddle with an expression that was almost friendly, in the way that a large predator could look almost friendly when it was confident and not yet hungry. I thought we might talk, man to man, before all this gets any further out of hand. What hand is that? The one you've been playing with Farrell and his manifests. Crow said it evenly, without accusation in his tone. Just the tone of a man who knows more than you expected and wants you to know he knows it. I have friends at the trading post, Colt. I have friends most places. I'm sure you do. What you're planning to do at the gathering, Crow said, is going to hurt people. Not me. I'll be fine. I always am. But the town, the people who depend on the grain exchange for their livelihood, on my operations for their employment. You start a fire with those papers, you're not burning just me. Colt looked at him. That's an interesting argument. I'll give you that. It's a true argument. It's a threat dressed as concern, which is different. Colt tilted his head slightly. You rode out here to tell me that if I expose what you've done, the people who work for you will suffer the consequences. And you want me to hear that as a reason to stay quiet. He paused. What I hear is a man who's run out of the kind of leverage that works on reasonable people and has moved on to the kind that works on frightened ones. Something moved behind Crow's eyes. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lived next door to anger in men who had learned to keep the real thing below the surface. You're making an enemy, Crow said. You made yourself one, Colt said. The night you had Hector Gill point at a woman with an empty bag and a hungry family and call her a thief in front of 40 people. The silence between them was the kind that had pressure in it. She's gotten to you, Crow said. There was something almost pitying in his voice. The pity of a man who has decided that what he's looking at is sentiment rather than principle, which made it, in his calculus, something he could dismiss. I understand it. She's a handsome woman in a hard situation. Men make poor decisions. I'll stop you there. Colt's voice had not risen. It did not need to. You can say whatever you need to say to make this make sense to yourself. But I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to be at that gathering. Farrell is going to be at that gathering. And the people of this town are going to look at numbers that don't lie, and they're going to make their own decisions. And whatever those decisions are, I'll live with them. He unlatched the gate, swung it open to the outside, and held it there. You rode a long way for a conversation that's over. I'll let you see yourself out. Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned the black horse and rode back toward the road without another word. Colt latched the gate and watched him go. Hannah had been standing at the corner of the barn. He had not seen her there when Crow arrived, and he did not know how much she had heard. She came forward now, slowly, and stopped beside him at the gate. They both watched the black horse grow smaller on the road until it was gone. He's not going to stop, Hannah said. No. He'll come at you through the council again, or through something else, before the gathering. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. Then, are you afraid? It was the kind of question people usually didn't ask a man like Colt Maddox, and the fact that she asked it directly, without softening it, without framing it as something other than what it was, said something about the distance they had traveled in 3 weeks from strangers to whatever they were now. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way the question deserved to be answered. I'm not afraid of Crow, he said. I'm afraid of not being enough, of having the right thing in my hand and not being able to make people see it. He paused. That's different from being afraid of him. Hannah nodded. She understood the distinction, had lived inside it, in fact, for most of the past 18 months. The difference between being afraid of a person and being afraid of not being sufficient to the thing the moment required. You're enough, she said, simply and without sentimentality. He looked at her. There was a long beat, not awkward, not weighted with the self-consciousness of two people edging toward something, but clear, in the way that certain moments in a person's life are clear, stripped of everything except what is actually true. Then the sound of May's voice drifted from the barn, announcing to Will in great detail and with considerable authority that Biscuit preferred being talked to about interesting topics rather than boring ones. And Will's response, patient, resigned, the voice of a boy who had calculated that agreeing was faster than arguing, broke the moment open into something lighter. Hannah almost smiled. I should go rescue Will. Probably, Colt said. She turned toward the barn, then stopped and turned back just slightly. Colt, she said. Yeah. Thank you for what you said to him. She held his gaze for a moment, that steady accountant's gaze that saw things clearly and did not pretend otherwise. For not making it about me being a handsome woman in a hard situation. He held her gaze. It was never about that. I know, she said. That's why I said thank you. She went to rescue Will from May's editorial opinions on horse conversation and Colt stood at the gate for another minute, looking at the road where Silas Crow had gone, doing the careful, methodical work of a man who knows that the next 2 days are going to require everything he has. The night before the gathering, Colt sat at his desk until very late, organizing the papers into the order that would tell the story most clearly. Farrell's manifest first, then the council filings, then the price records, then his own written account of what he had seen in the Alderman Depot. He wrote in a clear, even hand, without rhetoric, without appeal to emotion, because he had learned that the most persuasive documents were the ones that did not try to persuade, that simply laid the facts end to end and trusted the reader to arrive where the evidence pointed. At some point past midnight, he became aware that he was not alone. He looked up and found Hannah standing in the doorway of the front room, a shawl around her shoulders, watching him. "You should sleep," she said. "Soon." She looked at the papers spread across the desk, at the lamp burning low, at the careful, ordered work of a man building a case out of numbers and truth, and the stubborn refusal to let a lie stand unchallenged. "Can I help?" she asked. He looked at what remained. "Pull up that chair," he said. She pulled up the chair. She sat down across from him at the desk. And in the lamp-lit quiet of the ranch house, with the children sleeping in the back room and the prairie holding its dry, dark patience outside the window, they worked together through the small hours of the morning, going over the documents one more time, checking the sequence, making sure every number was where it needed to be and every connection was clear. They did not talk much. They didn't need to. But once, somewhere around 2 in the morning, Hannah looked up from the manifest she was checking and found Colt watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open in a way he didn't usually let himself be. Unguarded in the specific way of people who are tired enough that the careful management of their own face has stopped being worth the effort. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the manifest, and he looked back down at his papers, and neither of them said anything. But something had been acknowledged. Dawn was still an hour away when they finished. Hannah went back to the room where her children slept. Colt put the papers in careful order in his saddlebag, banked the lamp, and sat for a while in the dark. Tomorrow, today, now, Harlan Flats would gather. Silas Crow would stand in front of his neighbors and make his accusations with the confidence of a man who had been making accusations without consequence for long enough to believe he was untouchable. And Colt Maddox would stand up with a saddlebag full of numbers. He had done harder things. He thought about that for a while, trying to remember what they were, and somewhere in the trying he fell asleep in the chair with his boots on, and did not dream at all. He woke in the chair with a crick in his neck and the first gray light of morning coming through the window, and for exactly 3 seconds Colt Maddox existed in the uncomplicated space between sleep and full wakefulness, where nothing required anything of him. Then the day arrived in his mind all at once, complete, weighted, inevitable, and he stood up, rolled his shoulders, and went to start the stove. Hannah was already up. He could hear her moving in the back room, quiet and efficient, the sounds of a woman getting her children ready with the minimum of disruption. By the time he had coffee going, she appeared in the doorway, dressed carefully, not formally, because she did not own formal clothes, but with the specific intentionality of a woman who understood that how you presented yourself to a room that had already decided what it thought of you was its own kind of statement. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Her dress was clean, pressed as well as pressing by hand the night before could manage. She wore the expression she always wore when she had decided something and was done deliberating about it. "The children are coming," she said. It was not a question. Colt poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table for her. "I figured. Eliza can handle May. Will is—" She paused. "Will wants to be there." "He should be," Colt said. "He was the one Hector Gill pointed at. He deserves to be in the room when that gets answered." Hannah looked at him over her coffee cup. Something in her face shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of shift that happened when a person heard exactly the right thing said in exactly the right way. She nodded once, and that was the end of the discussion. They ate breakfast without ceremony, cornbread and the last of the preserves, May conducting a running commentary on the relative merits of various types of jam that required no response from anyone and received none. Will eating with the focused energy of a boy who understood that today was important without fully understanding why. Eliza sitting very straight and very quiet in the way she did when she was paying attention to everything at once. Colt checked the saddlebag twice. The papers were there. Farrell's manifests, the council filings, the price records, his own written account, organized and ordered, the careful architecture of a truth that had been waiting 4 months for someone to build it properly. They rode to town in the wagon. Colt drove. Hannah sat beside him on the bench. The 3 children were in the bed behind them, May leaning over the side, watching the prairie grass move past with the unwavering attention she brought to anything that qualified as interesting. Will sitting with his knees up and his chin resting on them. Eliza watching the road ahead with those dark, steady eyes. The gathering was set for 10 o'clock at the town hall, a wide, wood-floored building on the north end of Main Street that served as meeting space, courthouse, and community venue depending on what the occasion demanded. As Colt turned the wagon onto Main Street, it was already clear that the attendance was going to be significant. Horses lined both sides of the street. Wagons were pulled up along the open lot beside the grain exchange. People were moving toward the town hall in the particular way of people who have been waiting for something to happen and have decided that today is the day they're going to watch it. Some of them saw Colt's wagon and stopped watching other things. He kept his pace steady and his eyes on the road ahead. "Don't look at them," he said quietly, not quite to Hannah, not quite to the children, but to the wagon in general. "I'm not looking at them," Will said, in the voice of a boy who absolutely had been looking at them. "Good," Colt said. He found a spot to tie the wagon on the side street and helped May down from the bed. She immediately reached up and took his hand with the simple, total confidence of a 4-year-old who has decided that a particular adult is trustworthy, and Colt looked down at the small hand in his and felt something move through his chest that he did not have a word ready for. They walked to the town hall together. The room was already 3/4 full when they came through the door. The hall had been arranged with rows of chairs facing a raised platform at the front, where the 5-member town council sat behind a long table. Councilman Decker was there, the man who had ridden out to the ranch to deliver his concerned citizen speech, along with 4 others. At the far end of the council table, elevated slightly by the platform and by his own particular quality of physical presence, sat Silas Crow. He was not officially on the council, but he sat at their table as if he were, and nobody had moved him, which said everything worth knowing about the arrangement between Silas Crow and the governance of Harlan Flats. He saw Colt come in. His expression did not change. He was too practiced for that, but something in his posture shifted, a slight, controlled adjustment that a man less attentive than Colt might have missed. Crow had expected him to come. What he had not expected, perhaps, was the 4 of them, the widow and her 3 children, walking in beside the cowboy, visible to everyone in the room, refusing to be invisible. The murmur that moved through the crowd when Hannah Reed walked in was audible. People turned. People leaned together. Hannah looked straight ahead. Eliza matched her, step for step. Will walked with his jaw set and his fists at his sides, and May, bless the uncomplicated courage of 4-year-olds everywhere, looked around the crowded room with simple, clear-eyed curiosity. Colt guided them to seats along the side wall. He remained standing. At exactly 10 o'clock, Decker called the gathering to order with considerably more authority than Colt generally credited him with, which suggested that he had been coached on his opening or was running on the confidence that came from having a powerful man seated next to him. The quarterly business was dispensed with quickly. There was really only one item on anyone's mind today, and everyone in the room knew it. After 7 minutes of water rights discussion and a brief report on the road conditions south of town, Decker turned the floor over to Silas Crow. Crow stood. He was, Colt acknowledged privately, a compelling presence. He had the physicality of a man who filled a room and the voice of a man who had learned, over a long career of public maneuvering, exactly how to calibrate it. When to be quiet so people leaned in, when to be loud so people felt the weight of it. He looked out at the assembled citizens of Harlan Flats with the expression of a man who is reluctantly doing something painful for the good of the community. "Neighbors," he said, "I know we're all weary. 11 months of drought wears on a town the way nothing else can. It wears on our patience, our resources, and, if we're not careful, our judgment." He paused, letting the sympathy of it settle. "It is in that spirit of concern that I bring before this gathering a matter that should have been addressed formally some time ago. The matter of Hannah Reed." The room was very quiet. "This woman came to our town under circumstances that were unclear from the beginning," Crow continued. Since her arrival, there have been ongoing questions about the integrity of her family's conduct. The incident at the market last month, witnessed by reliable members of this community, was not, I regret to say, an isolated event. He produced a paper from the table in front of him. I have here a formal record of 3 separate complaints filed against Mrs. Reed over the past 6 months, 2 involving allegations of petty theft and 1 involving a disturbance. I'd like to see those complaints, Colt said. His voice came from the side of the room, and it was not loud, but it carried the specific quality of a sound that interrupts a rhythm people have settled into, and the room turned toward him with the collective movement of a field of grass when the wind changes direction. Decker looked at him. Mr. Maddox, there will be time for— I'd like to see those complaints, Colt said again, at the same volume, at the same unhurried pace. Because I've spoken with the town records officer, and formal complaints require signatures and dates of filing. I'd like to see whose names are on those papers and when they were submitted. A beat of silence. Crow looked at Colt with an expression that had shifted, just marginally, from the practiced sympathy he'd opened with to something that had more edge in it. This isn't a courtroom, Maddox. No, Colt agreed. It's a town gathering, which means it belongs to everyone in this room, not just the people at the front table. He looked at the crowd. Does anyone else want to see whose signatures are on those complaints before we decide what weight to give them? The murmur that moved through the room this time was different from the one that had followed Hannah's entrance. This one had a current in it. The particular current of people who have been told one story for a long time and have just felt, for the first time, the pull of another. Decker conferred briefly with the council members on either side of him. Then, with the reluctant air of a man who has decided that refusing will look worse than complying, he nodded. Crow placed the papers on the edge of the platform. Colt walked forward, picked them up, and read them. His face was expressionless. He turned them so that the man nearest him on the front row could see, and then passed them down the row without comment. What the room saw, as the papers moved from hand to hand, was that 2 of the 3 complaints bore no signatures at all, and the third bore the signature of Hector Gill, a man who worked directly for Silas Crow. Nobody said anything, but the papers passed through the room like a current of water finding its own level, and the quality of the silence changed. Colt walked back to his position at the side of the room. He reached into the saddlebag he'd carried in over one shoulder and removed the first set of papers. Farrell's freight manifests. I want to talk about flour, he said. Someone in the middle rows laughed. A single surprise sound, quickly suppressed, but real. Colt waited for the room to settle. Specifically, he continued, I want to talk about the difference between how much flour, grain, salt pork, and dried goods have been coming into Harlan Flats over the past 8 months, and how much Silas Crow has been reporting to this council as the basis for the prices at the grain exchange. He held up the manifest. These are freight records from the Eastern Trading Post, maintained by a man named Farrell, who has handled incoming loads on this route for 14 years. I'd like Mr. Farrell to speak to them. A murmur of surprise moved through the room as Farrell stood up from a seat near the back, small, ink-stained, impeccably organized in his manner, and made his way to the front. He took the manifest from Colt with the nod of a man accepting a tool he knows how to use. My name is Aaron Farrell, he said, in the clear, dry voice of a man more comfortable with numbers than audiences. I have been processing freight for Harlan Flats and the surrounding territory since before most of this town's current buildings were built. What I'm holding is a record of every load that has cleared my post bound for this town in the past 8 months. I'll tell you what the numbers show. He told them. He did it without drama and without embellishment, because the numbers were dramatic enough without help. Load volumes down 12% over the drought period. Market shortage reports filed by Silas Crow claiming drops of 35 to 40%. The difference between those 2 figures applied to the price increases at the grain exchange over 6 months, representing a sum that Farrell calculated in his careful, methodical way as he spoke. The room was very still. That's not possible, said a man near the front. One of the ranchers, a broad-weathered man named Greer, who had lived in Harlan Flats for 20 years and was not, as a general rule, easily impressed by anything. If the loads are coming in at 12% down, where's the rest of it going? That, Colt said, is an excellent question. He produced the next set of papers, his written account of the Alderman Depot. 12 days ago, I rode to the old Alderman property, which Silas Crow has leased for the past 4 months under the description of equipment storage. What I found there was grain, dried goods, salt pork. Supply stores stamped with Harlan Flats inventory markings. Enough to stock this town's market for 3 months. The silence that followed was the kind that had mass to it, the kind that you could feel pressing against your eardrums. "That's a lie." Crow's voice came from the platform, still controlled, still carrying the authority he'd walked in with, but with something different in the texture of it now, something that had to work harder to sound like certainty. Maddox was trespassing on my leased property and has fabricated a self-serving account to protect a woman he has an obvious personal interest in protecting. "Then let the council ride out to the Alderman property and see what's there," Colt said immediately. "The goods have been relocated." "I know. You moved them 2 days after I was there, which is interesting behavior for a man with nothing to hide." Colt looked at Crow directly. "You want to talk about the relocation? Because I'm happy to talk about the relocation. Specifically, I'm happy to talk about the wagon tracks heading south from the Alderman Depot and the timing of that movement relative to my visit, and what a jury, not a town council, a jury might make of a man who relocated 3,000 square feet of stored goods in the middle of a week for no stated reason." Crow's jaw tightened. It was the first fully uncontrolled thing Colt had seen from him. "You have no proof." "I have Farrell's manifests," Colt said. "I have your council filings. I have my testimony. And I have—" He paused, and in the pause reached into the saddlebag one more time, producing the final set of papers. The payment records. The room moved. Not physically. Nobody stood up. Nobody rushed forward. But something in the collective posture of the assembled crowd shifted, the way a field moves before a storm, every blade of grass registering the change in pressure. Farrell spoke from where he stood at the front. "In my files, I maintain copies of freight payment records, invoices for loads received, cross-referenced against what is reported to destination markets. When I compared Crow's grain exchange payment invoices against the manifests, 3 of them showed payment for loads that were recorded as received at the Alderman property rather than the exchange, the property he leases, not the market." He held up the papers. "These are not allegations. These are numbers. They either match or they don't." They didn't match. The room understood this. You could see the understanding move through it, not all at once, not cleanly, but person by person, the way understanding always actually moves through crowds, which is to say imperfectly and unevenly, but inexorably. Greer, the rancher near the front, stood up. He was the kind of man whose standing up meant something in a room, large enough and plain-spoken enough and present in Harlan Flats long enough that people instinctively looked when he moved. "I want to know about the shortage reports," he said, speaking not to the council but to the room in general, in the manner of a man who has stopped recognizing a distinction between the two. If the loads were coming in at 12% down, and Crow was filing 35% shortage reports, where was that difference going? I want someone at this table to answer that question in plain language. Decker looked at Crow. Crow looked at the room. And in that moment, in the look that passed between the powerful man and his accommodating council member, in the hesitation that lasted exactly 1 second too long, the crowd of Harlan Flats saw what it had perhaps always suspected and had not known, until now that it was allowed to see. "He was holding it," said a woman's voice from the middle rows. The voice of the council member's wife, the same woman who had said these kinds of people at the market, the same woman whose contempt had been so polished and so precise. She said it not with satisfaction, but with the flat, stripped tone of a person who has just done the arithmetic and arrived somewhere she didn't want to be. "He was holding the supply back until prices were high enough. While we—" She stopped. Her husband put a hand on her arm. She looked at it and did not shake it off, but she also did not soften. "While we counted coins." "That's a serious allegation," Decker said, with the specific exhaustion of a man watching the thing he has helped hold together come apart. "It's a mathematical conclusion," Farrell said mildly. "The allegation is in the numbers." Crow stood up. He was still large. He was still imposing. But something had gone out of the room's response to those qualities. The reflexive deference that men like him accumulated over years of careful management. And without it, his size was just size, and his voice was just a voice. "I built this town's grain trade from nothing," he said. I invested capital that nobody else was willing to risk. I created the exchange, I negotiated the supplier contracts, I maintained operations through 3 hard seasons before this one. What I charge for those services is the market rate, a rate that reflects real conditions. Real conditions you manufactured, Colt said. The words landed in the room like a stone in still water. Then from the back of the hall a man stood up. A quiet man, someone Colt vaguely recognized as a farmer from the South Lowlands. A man named Pratt, who had been in Harlan Flats for 7 years, and who in Colt's recollection had never spoken at a public gathering before. I sold my wife's jewelry in February, Pratt said. His voice was quiet enough that the room went immediately silent to hear it. To pay the grain exchange price for the winter stores, because I believed it was drought driving those prices. He paused. My children went without new boots this year because I believed there wasn't enough. Another pause, longer. Was there enough? The question was not directed at anyone in particular. It was directed at the room, at the moment, at the silence that had opened up around the numbers and the manifests and the payment records. Farrell answered it, quietly, precisely, the way he answered everything. Based on these records, there was enough, he said. There was not as much as in a good year, but there was enough. Pratt sat back down. He did not say anything else. He didn't need to. What happened next did not happen all at once. And it was not orderly, and it was not the clean, dramatic pivot of a crowd that has seen the light and is now marching unanimously toward justice. Real crowds didn't work that way. What happened was more complicated and more human than that. It was the slow, difficult, uneven process of a large group of people revising something they had believed and finding the experience neither comfortable nor simple. People talked over each other. Several men near the front directed pointed questions at the council, at Decker specifically, who was handling the situation with the trapped, diminishing dignity of a man who has realized too late that the ship he decided to board is going down. 2 of the other council members had gone very quiet and were examining the papers that had been passed forward to them with the focused attention of people who are looking for a way out of a position they no longer wish to hold. Crow attempted twice more to redirect the room's attention. Once by questioning the legitimacy of Farrell's manifests, once by returning to the subject of Hannah Reed and the original market theft. The second attempt was the worst strategic decision of the 2. When he said Hannah's name, the room's response was different from what it would have been 2 hours earlier. Not sympathetic exactly, but no longer willing. The easy consensus that had allowed 40 people at a market to watch a woman with an empty bag be publicly accused had dissolved somewhere in the arithmetic of Farrell's numbers, and without that consensus, Crow's voice sounded different. Smaller. Hannah had been sitting along the side wall through all of it, with May on her lap and Eliza beside her, and Will pressed close against her other side. She had not spoken. She had not been asked to speak, and she had not offered to because she had understood before they arrived, that this was not her fight to make. She was the reason for it, but she could not be the one to make it. A woman in her position arguing for her own innocence in a room that had already decided what it thought of her was a different thing than a man with documented evidence making the same argument, and resenting that fact did not make it less true. So she had sat and watched and held her children close, and let Colt Maddox do what he had set out to do with those papers she'd helped him organize through the small hours of the night before. It was May who moved first, in the end. At some point during the growing noise of the room, May had gotten down from Hannah's lap, and Hannah, distracted by the council exchange, had not immediately registered it. She became aware of the small absence and looked to her left and found May standing 3 feet away, looking across the crowded room with her serious, owl-like eyes, apparently conducting her own assessment of the situation. Then May walked forward, through the crowd, between the chairs, stepping around feet with the careful, deliberate navigation of a 4-year-old who has a destination in mind. She walked all the way to where Colt was standing at the front of the room, and she reached up and took his hand. Colt looked down at her. The room, in the midst of its complicated, noisy process of revision, went briefly quieter around that small movement, the way rooms sometimes went quieter around something that was very simple in the middle of something very complicated. May looked up at him. "Are you done yet?" she asked. He almost smiled. "Getting there," he said. "Okay, said May, and stayed where she was, holding his hand, apparently prepared to wait as long as necessary. Hannah, watching from the side wall, felt something give way inside her. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. She did not cry. She was not, in general, a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start in the Harlan Flats town hall, but she felt it give, and she let it. Eliza reached over and took her hand without looking at her, the way Eliza sometimes did things, quietly, without making it a production, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a 12-year-old who had been paying attention and understood exactly what the moment required. Will was watching the front of the room with an expression that had something fierce and new in it, the expression of a boy watching the man who had called him a thief run out of room to stand in. The council withdrew to confer. They were gone for 22 minutes, Colt counted, and when they came back, Decker looked like a man who had aged several years in a short hallway. He read from a prepared statement: formal review of the shortage reports filed against Crow's Exchange, suspension of the grain exchange operating license pending investigation, and the referral of the matter to the territorial marshal's office. He did not look at Crow while he read it. The marshal's deputy, who had been sent for at some point during the proceedings, a detail that told Colt that someone on the council had been watching the wind shift and had acted accordingly, was waiting outside the hall. He came in through the side door. He spoke briefly and quietly with Silas Crow. And Silas Crow, who had arrived at this gathering as the most powerful man in Harlan Flats, and who was leaving it as something considerably smaller, stood up from the platform table with the careful, controlled movements of a man whose instincts were telling him to make no sudden gestures, and went with the deputy without resistance. The room watched him go. Then the room turned and looked at Hannah Reed. It was a different kind of looking than the market had been. Not the hot, pointed, consensus-driven look of a crowd with a target. The look that had followed her family out of the lot that evening a month ago while the storm gathered on the horizon. This was something more complicated and less comfortable. This was the look of people who had gotten something wrong and knew it, and were sitting with the knowledge and had not yet figured out what to do with it. Hannah stood up. She did not say anything. She did not make a speech. She had not prepared one, and she would not have wanted to deliver it if she had. She simply stood, with her back straight and her chin level, and let the room look at her, and gave it back the same steady gaze she had always had, the gaze that had not changed in a month of being called what she wasn't. It was Greer, the rancher from the front row, who broke it. He stood up again, the same big, weathered man who had asked the question about the shortage reports. He turned to face Hannah from across the room. He took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology." The words were simple and they were not easy, and the room knew it. And in the knowing of it, the room began slowly to do the same. Not everyone. Not all at once. Some people left without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. But enough people stayed, and enough of them said the difficult thing, that the temperature of the room changed. The council member's wife, the one who had been the first to say these kinds of people, and the first to say while we counted coins, approached Hannah with an expression that was stripped of the social architecture she usually wore, and said simply that she was sorry, and that she hoped the children were well. Hannah said the children were well. She said it without irony, which required something from her, but she gave it. Colt came back to her side, May still attached to his hand and showing no signs of releasing it. He stood beside Hannah in the emptying hall and looked at the dispersing crowd and said nothing for a long moment. "It's done," Hannah said. "The marshal's office will want to follow up," he said. "There'll be more questions. The investigation into the exchange records is going to take time." "I know." She looked at him. "But it's done." He looked back at her. Around them, the hall was clearing. The complicated, uneven clearing of a space where something important had happened, and people were trying to figure out how to carry it home with them. Outside the windows, Harlan Flats was going about the business of an ordinary morning, indifferent as only a frontier town could be to the revolutions happening inside its public buildings. May tugged Colt's hand. "I'm hungry," she announced, to no one and to everyone, with the complete, uncomplicated authority of a 4-year-old whose patience has reached its reasonable limit. Will snorted. Eliza pressed her lips together against a smile that won anyway. And Colt Maddox, who had walked into this town hall that morning carrying a saddlebag full of carefully ordered truth and the quiet, stubborn certainty that it would be enough, felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Something open, something that didn't have a guard on it. And he looked at the small hand in his and the woman beside him, and the two older children trying unsuccessfully not to smile. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." He said home without thinking about it, and nobody corrected him. The word home settled over the wagon ride back like a blanket that nobody commented on, but everyone felt. May had fallen asleep against Colt's arm before they reached the edge of town, her small weight listing sideways with the complete trust of a child who has decided, without deliberation, that a particular shoulder is a safe place to rest. Colt adjusted his arm to accommodate her without breaking the horse's pace, and Hannah, sitting beside him on the bench, watched him do it, and looked back at the road ahead and said nothing. Will sat in the wagon bed behind them and talked for most of the ride, a steady, relieved, slightly giddy stream of observation and commentary that was the verbal equivalent of a pressure valve releasing. He talked about what Greer had looked like when the manifests were passed to him, and what the council member's wife had said to their mother afterward, and whether he thought Silas Crow had known all along that it would catch up with him, or whether men like that convinced themselves it never would. He asked Colt what he thought. Colt said he thought men like that generally understood the risk and decided the reward was worth it until the moment it wasn't, which was a different thing from not knowing. Will considered this with the serious, slightly furrowed attention he brought to information he intended to keep. Eliza sat beside her brother and said very little, which was the way Eliza processed important days, by going quiet and letting things arrange themselves in her mind at their own pace before she said anything about them. Once, she reached forward and put her hand briefly on Hannah's shoulder, and Hannah covered it with her own hand for a moment, and that was enough between them. The ranch came into view the same way it had on that first storm-dark night. Gradually, out of the flat landscape, the fence line first, and then the barn, and then the lit windows, though the light this time was afternoon sun rather than a single lamp. It looked different in daylight, or perhaps it just looked different because they were looking at it differently. Not as shelter offered by a stranger in an emergency, but as something else, something that had accumulated meaning over 5 weeks of shared mornings and shared work and shared meals and conversations that had gone on longer than practical necessity required. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and sat for a moment before climbing down. "I want to say something," he said, which was enough of an anomaly, Colt Maddox prefacing what he was about to say, that everyone in the wagon paid immediate attention. He was looking at the reins in his hands. He was not, Hannah noticed, a man who found the beginning of certain kinds of sentences easy to locate. She watched him find it. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else gets said. What happened today? What happened this whole past month? None of it was done with any expectation of return. I want you to know that because I'm about to say some things that I'd rather say before the moment passes and I talk myself out of it." He paused, adjusted. "This ranch needs more than one person. It's always needed more than one person, and I've been running it alone because alone was what I had, and I made my peace with that." Another pause. "I've been less at peace with it since about the 3rd morning you were here." The wagon was very quiet. May shifted in her sleep. The horses moved their feet with the mild impatience of animals who have arrived somewhere and would like the business of arriving to be concluded. "I'm not asking for an answer today," Colt continued. "I'm not asking for an answer this week or this month. I'm asking you to consider, all of you," he said, and here he turned briefly to include the wagon bed, where Will had gone absolutely motionless, and Eliza was watching with the focused intensity of a girl who had been paying close attention to the shape of this situation for some time and was now watching it resolve into the form she had suspected it might take. "I'm asking you to consider whether what's been built here over the past 5 weeks is something worth continuing to build. And I'm saying that my opinion, for what it's worth, is that it is." He stopped. He had the look of a man who has said the thing and is now waiting for the ground to respond, which it may or may not do, and he has accepted the uncertainty. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the flat landscape around them, that late-day golden quality that the prairie produced in its most forgiving mood, when the hardness of it went warm and the distance of it felt like possibility rather than exposure. "Ask me again in a month," she said. Something in his face that had been carefully managed let go. Not dramatically. Colt Maddox did nothing dramatically. But it let go, and what was underneath it was simple and real and had clearly been there for a while. "All right," he said. "In the meantime," Hannah said, "May is going to wake up soon and she's going to be hungry, and I believe we have a pot of beans that needs finishing." "We do," Colt confirmed. "Then let's go finish it," she said. He climbed down from the wagon. He lifted the sleeping May without waking her, which required a specific combination of strength and gentleness, and carried her toward the house. Will scrambled out of the wagon bed and fell into step beside him, and after a moment reached up and took a handful of Colt's sleeve in his fist. Not his hand, his sleeve, in the way of a boy who wants contact but hasn't fully decided yet that he's allowed to want it. Colt did not look down. He did not comment on it. He simply walked a little slower so that Will didn't have to reach. Eliza stood for a moment beside the wagon, watching all of this. Then she looked at her mother. "You already know," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. "I know some things," Hannah said carefully. "You know what you're going to say. In a month." Eliza's dark eyes were absolutely level. She had her father's eyes, Hannah had always thought, Thomas's particular quality of seeing things clearly and not pretending otherwise. "You already know." Hannah held her daughter's gaze. Then she said, "Help me with the horses." Eliza almost smiled, that particular almost smile that meant she had her answer. She went to help with the horses. The investigation into Silas Crow's operation took 3 months. The Territorial Marshal's office sent 2 men, serious, efficient men with notebooks and the specific patience of investigators who had learned that the truth in financial crimes lived in the gap between what papers said and what actually happened. They were in Harlan Flats for the better part of 2 weeks, during which they spoke with Farrell extensively, reviewed the grain exchange records in full, located the relocated depot stores on a property 40 miles south that Crow had leased under a different name, and interviewed most of the town's significant merchants and council members. Decker cooperated fully, which was the response of a man who had calculated that being a cooperative witness was considerably preferable to being an uncooperative subject of investigation. 2 other council members did the same. The picture that emerged was more systematic than even Farrell's manifests had suggested. Crow had been working the supply manipulation for nearly 14 months, had diverted enough goods to account for most of the artificial price increases, and had in the process extracted from the ordinary citizens of Harlan Flats an amount of money that, when the Marshal's investigators put it on paper, made the room go quiet for a long moment. The territorial prosecutor filed charges in the 6th week. The trial was set for the county seat, 40 miles east, in the spring. Colt attended the preliminary hearing as a witness. He testified to what he had seen at the Alderman Depot with the same flat, precise economy he brought to everything. What was there? How much of it? What markings were on it? When it had been moved? Under cross-examination from Crow's attorney, a man brought up from the city who was good at his job and knew it, Colt answered every question and volunteered nothing extra and did not get rattled, which appeared to frustrate the attorney considerably. Farrell testified for the better part of a day. He brought his files. He was, by general consensus afterward, the most effective witness anyone in the county courthouse had seen in some time, owing to the fact that he had 14 years of meticulous personal records and the calm, unshakable manner of a man who has been keeping his own documentation precisely because he always suspected the day would come when it mattered. Silas Crow was convicted in the spring on 4 counts of commercial fraud and 1 count of deliberate market manipulation, the last being a charge the prosecutor had argued for specifically because he felt the existing statute, while rarely applied clearly here. He was sentenced to 5 years and the forfeiture of his grain exchange assets and real property holdings in Harlan Flats, the proceeds of which were to be distributed, after administrative costs, among the affected town residents according to a formula the court worked out with considerable effort over several months. When the verdict was announced, Colt was at the ranch. He heard about it 2 days later from a man who had ridden in from the county seat, and he received the information the way he received most information, without visible celebration, without vindication performed for an audience. He thanked the man. He went back to what he was doing, which was repairing the north fence line. Hannah found him there an hour later. She stood on the other side of the fence and looked at him. He kept working for a moment, then straightened up. "You heard," he said. "I heard." She was quiet for a moment. The spring air had a different quality than the air of those first drought-hardened weeks. looser, carrying moisture, the smell of things that were green and growing again. The rains had come in February, modest by normal standards, but real, and the prairie had responded with the eager, slightly desperate gratitude of a landscape that had been waiting a long time. "How do you feel?" He considered the question the same way he'd considered the one she'd asked about fear the day Crow had ridden out to the ranch, with the honesty the question deserved. "Glad it's done," he said. "Glad it came out the way it did. Not much beyond that. The feeling part of it." He shook his head slightly. "That happened a while ago, when the room turned, when Greer took his hat off." Hannah nodded. She understood that. The feeling part of it had happened for her in the same moment, in the specific cellular reality of a crowd changing its mind, of the man who had called her family thieves standing up and taking off his hat. The legal conclusion was important, but the human conclusion had come first. "The court's distribution process is going to take months," she said. "I know. Some of those families are still stretched thin." He looked at her. He knew she was moving towards something. "The grain exchange is going to need new management," she said. "Someone who knows the supply routes, knows the freight pricing, knows what fair looks like, and intends to keep it that way." She held his gaze. "Farrell has said he'd be willing to relocate if the position were properly established. But someone from this town would need to anchor it, someone the community trusts." "Are you suggesting I run the grain exchange?" "I'm suggesting that the people who need someone to trust with that operation are going to need someone to ask." She paused. "Greer has already asked. The morning after the verdict. He rode out here specifically." Colt looked at the fence line. "Greer asked you, or Greer asked me?" "He asked me where to find you," Hannah said, which is its own answer. A silence in which the spring wind moved through the new grass along the fence line and a hawk described a slow, patient circle somewhere above the south pasture. "I'll talk to Greer," Colt said. "I thought you might," said Hannah, and the small private satisfaction in her voice was the closest thing to teasing that Hannah Reed allowed herself, which was close enough. The month he had asked for passed, and then another, and he did not ask again, not because he had forgotten or reconsidered, but because he understood that some questions didn't need to be asked twice if the answer was already being lived. It was Hannah who said it, in the end. She said it on an evening in late April, on the porch, in the cooling air after supper, while Eliza read inside by the lamp and the sounds of Will and May in the yard came through the open window in the intermittent way of children who move between being visible and being occupied by something that doesn't require adult involvement. She said, "I think it's time." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, because he wanted to be sure he understood, and because the habit of precision was too ingrained to abandon even now, he said, "Time for what, specifically?" Hannah looked at him. "Don't make me say all of it." "Say enough of it," he said, "so I know we're talking about the same thing." She looked out at the yard where May was explaining something at length to a fence post with the pedagogical commitment she brought to all her educational endeavors. The evening light was long and warm and doing what it did to the prairie, which was make it look, briefly, like a place that had always been gentle. "I was 31 years old when I came to Harlan Flats," Hannah said. "I had a cracked wheel, and 2 tired mules and 3 children and 4 months of grief I hadn't finished yet. I told myself that was enough to manage. That was enough to fill a life, and anything beyond it was asking for more than I had a right to ask for." She paused. "I was wrong about that. I think I've been wrong about that for a while. I just needed time to be sure." He said nothing. He was listening in the way that Colt listened when something mattered, completely, without preparing his response while the other person was still talking. "I'm sure," Hannah said. He took her hand. He did it the same way he did most things. Without ceremony, without making it larger than it was. With the simple directness of a man who has learned to act on the thing, rather than deliberate about the acting. His hand was scarred and work-worn and warm, and Hannah looked at it holding hers for a moment before she looked back at the yard. "May is going to be insufferable about this," she said. "May is already insufferable about this," Colt said. "She told me 2 weeks ago that she thought I should marry her mother." Hannah turned to look at him. "She did not. She was very direct about it. She said she had given the matter considerable thought and had concluded it was the correct decision." He paused. She also said that if I agreed, I should probably get a dog, because in her assessment the ranch was missing one. Hannah pressed her lips together, failed completely at not smiling. She's not wrong about the dog. No, Colt agreed. She's generally not wrong about much. From the yard, May's voice drifted up, still instructing the fence post. Somewhere inside, Eliza turned a page. Will appeared at the corner of the barn and then disappeared again, which meant he was either investigating something or had already found something worth investigating, both of which were essentially equivalent. Colt looked at Hannah in the evening light, this woman who had walked out of a storm with nothing but her children and her spine and her stubborn, undefeated refusal to be made small, and felt, with the particular quiet certainty that had characterized the best decisions of his life, that everything that had led him to this porch and this evening had been, in whatever way things were allowed to be worth something, worth it. I'll ask Greer if he knows anyone with a litter, he said. The dog, Hannah said, with a patience that was also its own kind of tenderness, can wait until after the wedding. Fair enough, Colt said. They married in June, on the ranch, on a Saturday morning when the prairie was doing its summer best, and the sky was the particular blue that appeared between the drought's end and the high summer's heat, clear and deep and generous. There was no elaborate ceremony, which suited both of them. Greer came, and Farrell rode in from the trading post, and several families from town came out in their wagons, among them people who had been present at the market that night in autumn, and who arrived now with the slightly different quality of attention that people bring to occasions where they are also, in some way, making an amends. The justice of the peace was a lean, cheerful man from the county seat who had performed this particular function enough times to know when the occasion was genuine and when it was performance. And this one, he could tell from the moment he arrived, was genuine. Eliza stood beside her mother. She wore the expression of a person who is very pleased about something and is managing the pleasure with her customary restraint, which meant that she looked approximately 12% happier than her baseline, which for Eliza was visible from a considerable distance. Will stood beside Colt with the focused solemnity of a boy who has been assigned a role and intends to execute it correctly, which meant he stood very straight and very still and only looked at his boots twice. May wore a dress that Hannah had made from a piece of blue cotton she'd found at the general store, and she had opinions about it, and had shared them during the fitting process at considerable length. And the dress was almost exactly what she had specified, which May accepted as a reasonable outcome. She stood in the front of the gathered group and watched the proceedings with the judicial attention she brought to most things. And when the justice of the peace reached the part of the ceremony that concluded with the expression of public commitment, May said, clearly and without being asked, "Good," in a tone that indicated she considered the matter settled and was prepared to move on. Several people laughed. May looked around at them with the expression of someone who does not understand why people are laughing, but is willing to allow it. Afterward, there was food, considerably more of it than a ranch kitchen could produce alone, because the women who came from town had brought things: bread, preserves, dried fruit, a pie that Greer's wife had made, and that Greer had carried in his saddlebag with the focused care of a man transporting something irreplaceable. The tables were set outside in the yard, and the afternoon moved through them all with the unhurried quality of time that is being spent on exactly the right thing. At some point in the middle of it, Colt found himself standing at the fence line at the edge of the yard, looking out at the south pasture where the cattle moved in the long afternoon light. He had a cup of something in his hand in no particular destination, which was not a state he found himself in very often, and he was in the process of simply standing in it when he became aware of Will beside him. The boy had not announced himself. He had simply appeared, the way Will appeared places, moving through a space without quite making it known he was doing so until he was already there. They stood at the fence together for a moment in companionable quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Will said. "Go ahead. Were you scared at the gathering when you stood up and said all that stuff about the manifests in the depot?" Will was looking at the cattle, not at Colt, and the way he asked questions that mattered to him. "Before you started talking, were you scared?" Colt thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. Will looked at him then. "Really? Really? You didn't look scared." "That's different from not being scared," Colt said. "Being scared is just your body telling you that the thing you're about to do matters. What you do with that information is the part that's up to you." Will turned this over. Colt could see him storing it in the particular way he stored information he intended to use. Not immediately, but eventually, when the occasion for it arrived. My dad was scared of things, Will said, after a moment. It came out carefully, like something being set down gently rather than dropped. He didn't always show it either, but I could tell sometimes. Colt was quiet, giving the moment its proper space. He was a good man, Will said. It was a statement rather than a question, but it had a question at the bottom of it. The kind that 8-year-olds asked about fathers they'd lost young. The kind that needed ongoing answers rather than a single conclusive one. From everything your mother's told me, Colt said. He was. Will nodded. Another moment of quiet. The cattle moved in the pasture with their slow, indifferent grace. I'm glad you found us, Will said. Then he reconsidered. I'm glad you found us on the road, even though it was raining. Colt looked at the boy beside him, at the gap-toothed, quick-minded, good-hearted boy who had stood with his fists clenched while a crowd decided what to think of him, and who had walked into that town hall with his jaw set and his shoulders back, and who was now standing at a fence post on what was, Colt thought, with the clean, unambiguous certainty of something that simply was his home now, in every way the word applied. Me too, Will, he said. Me too. Will nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. Then he turned back toward the yard, where May had apparently organized some of the younger children from the visiting families into a game whose rules were unclear but whose enforcement was enthusiastic, and Will's presence was evidently required. Colt watched him go. He stood at the fence for another minute, and then Hannah came to stand beside him. Appearing with the same ease with which she moved through most spaces now, the self-consciousness of the early weeks replaced by something settled and particular. She stood close enough that their shoulders touched, looking out at the same pasture. What were you two talking about? She asked. Thomas, he said. Hannah was quiet for a moment. He felt her breathe. What did you say? That he was a good man, from everything I'd been told. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, He was. She leaned into his shoulder slightly, just slightly. He would have liked you. I hope so. He had good judgment about people, she said. It was one of his best qualities. A pause. Almost as good as mine. Colt looked at her. She was watching the pasture with the expression she wore when she was pleased with herself, the expression that was almost nothing, that required knowing her to read. Almost, he said. She looked up at him, and something passed between them that was too ordinary and too complete to require a name. The particular recognition of two people who have come through something together and arrived against reasonable odds somewhere worth arriving. In the yard behind them, May's game had reached some kind of critical ruling dispute that required her full regulatory attention. Eliza could be heard from inside the kitchen, calmly and efficiently managing the dessert situation. Will's voice rose briefly above the general noise, making an argument about something, and was answered by the collective voice of several children, which meant he was either losing or winning decisively. With Will, it was often hard to tell which was which until the outcome was clear. The cattle moved into the south pasture. The summer sky held its generous blue over the flat, breathing landscape of the frontier. Somewhere to the north, the town of Harlan Flats went about the business of a Saturday afternoon, changed in the ways that mattered and continuing in the ways that towns always continued, imperfectly, collectively, with the gradual, uneven motion of a community that has looked at itself clearly and found it difficult and necessary and is doing it anyway. And at the fence line of the Maddox Ranch, a woman who had come through the worst kind of weather a person could face, not the storm that had soaked them through that autumn night, but the other kind, the kind that lives inside communities and travels on words and ruins lives more efficiently than any weather system nature has ever produced, stood with her shoulder against the shoulder of the man who had opened a door when no one else would, and looked out at the land that was theirs now, and at the children who were becoming what children became when they were given safety and room, and people who chose to show up for them every morning without being asked. It was not a perfect life. The frontier did not offer perfect lives. It offered hard ground and long distances and seasons that sometimes tested the limits of what a person could endure. The drought had ended, but there would be other difficult years because that was the nature of the land and the nature of time. There would be things to struggle with, decisions that didn't have easy answers, Moments when the accumulated weight of everything was more than it seemed like any reasonable amount of strength could hold. But strength, Hannah Reed had learned, was not the same as the absence of weight. It was what you built quietly and without recognition in the space between one hard thing and the next. It was what Eliza carried in her careful, watchful eyes. It was what Will carried in his clenched fists and his quick, open heart. It was what May carried in her complete 4-year-old certainty that the world was fundamentally explicable if you just paid enough attention to it. And it was what a lone cowboy on a dark road had offered to a shivering family. Not rescue, not salvation, just the simple, radical, underrated act of a warm meal and an open door, which turned out, in the end, to be everything.